Chapter 17. This particular safe house wasn't known to the recusancy. It was one of Antonio's personal fallbacks for special circumstances like this. A single room above an alleyway, a few yards from the bustle of a wharf. Seagulls hooting, the hammered clang of repairs, metal driven into metal, a drunken bell lurching to and fro on the irregular waves, the constant murmur of voices from the synthfish production hub, drifting and pooling with the slosh of the sea. The alley went undisturbed. Most of the action was up on the main drag, along the waterfront. A grubby dock worker shot down the passageway, spitting and scratching his groin. One old soak leaned into the wall below Antonio's window and relieved himself into an open box of discarded cabbages. Oblivious to its stale reek, Antonio surveyed the alley. On the table beside him lay a handgun, two old eyelines hooked up to an electric mishmash of cannibalized tech, some dirty bandages and swabs, a bottle of rum, and a glass tumbler with 2 fingers of the amber spirit. He drained the glass and winced, hunching over to relieve the raw ache in his belly. The macro scalpel in the safe house medkit was rudimentary, a far cry from the modern medical facilities he'd have liked. Still, it had done what it was supposed to, and the flesh gun should be well bonded within a few days. Perdita's belly. Swelling, pressing forth. He thought of fruit, of nectarines and peaches and plums absorbing juice and bulging on the branch. A promise held in her expanding navel, reaching towards its inherent teleos. A child. Fatherhood dominated his mind. Free from detention and the cruel confines of that mass car, Antonio repeated events in his mind, trying to make sense of it all. But again and again, his thoughts were interrupted. He couldn't stop thinking about her safety. Their safety, he corrected himself. The recusant agent had a fresh purpose. He must shield them. Antonio was the pitted stone around their seed. The urge to protect was uncontrollable, an instinct much greater than he was. His breath shivered inside him as he considered the worst. Her execution. Or miscarriage, under duress and torture, or God knows what these people were capable of, some sort of forced abortion. It occurred to Antonio that Perdita might even abort his baby. If she escaped capture, went underground, what had she said? Debrief, identity reassignment, and while we're at it, poof, termination. He had to find her. A few seagulls drifted over the alleyway, catching the breeze in their bowed wings. Antonio refilled his glass. Contacting the recusancy was the obvious option. So why hadn't he? Where had this reluctance to follow protocol come from? There was the guilt. He could acknowledge that. Corporate security had mined him for intel. He shivered at the memory of the interrogation, something burrowing inside him. The complete loss of autonomy, his memories laid bare and picked over by those fucking vultures. How many of his consociates had he left open to attack? He'd compromised the whole movement. The whole movement? Who was he kidding? Most of them had already been dismissed to the RMZ. There were only a handful of recusants operating in relative freedom. And now he'd condemned them, too. He wished them luck, but knew there was none to be had. Sensing defeat percolating down through his soul, Antonio suspected this change had been brewing for a while. He remembered how he'd felt as he'd tried to escape the officers, scared and full of regret. He didn't used to be like this. There used to be certainty, hard and binding. But now he knew only doubt and self-reproach. And a will. An instinct to father the child, to protect their mother. Was this why he hadn't returned to the recusancy? Because, truth be told, he no longer wanted to be an agent. Antonio opened the window and slapped a magneto strip onto the junction box mounted a few feet away on the brickwork. The strip supported a coax cable, which Antonio trailed back into the room. A few splices, connections, and a drop or two of solder later, and he'd hooked into the net via a proxy carrier. One advantage of this particular safe house was the public data conduit on the external wall. He clamped the nav mobility receiver into its place in the circuit, hoping it hadn't been damaged when he'd wrenched it from the wrecked Mascar. This small piece of hardware should have all the digital handshakes he'd need to bust into their network. He'd still have some code to hack, but now he could bypass the worst of it. A back door, a ghost bridge. There'd be data somewhere, intel on her location, a trail to follow. An image floated up from one of the eye lines, and Antonio started checking the integrity of the receiver, preparing for his raid on the Dismamona servers.